Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this sunny evening, at least here in Chicago. My name is Carmelo Barbaro. I'm the Executive Director of the Inclusive Economy Lab at the Harris School of Public Policy. I'm really excited to invite you all, or to welcome you all to the initial event in our Summer of Social Impact series. Today, we'll be talking about some of the Inclusive Economy Lab's partnerships with key stakeholders in Chicago around supporting an effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and supporting the city's low-income, Black, and Latinx communities in securing stable housing through the coming months. So really excited today to kick off the discussion with a fireside chat of sorts between Faculty Director Marianne Bertrand and Dean Baker of the Harris School of Public Policy. Afterward, we'll hear from a panel discussion with Harris alum Emily Metz, as well as Daniel Hertz from the city's Department of Housing, and Erendira Rendon from the Resurrection Project. So really excited to welcome you all today, and thank you for joining.
Thanks so much for kicking things off, Carmelo. We're just thrilled to partner with the Inclusive Economy Lab on this series, and we have a series of Summer of Social Impact events coming up over the summer. This is the first of 3, and there's no better way to kick it off than with a conversation with the Inclusive Economy Lab Director, Marianne Bertrand. She's also the Chris P. Dialinus Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and the Pritzker Director of the Inclusive Economy Lab. And the Inclusive Economy Lab is one of the 5 urban labs that sit at the Harris School in the University of Chicago, and it's a wonderful opportunity for us to partner across the city and across the country and across the world with people who are working hard to make our economy more inclusive, to make opportunities in economic realms, health, food security, housing security, and so many other ways that we can help improve the well-being of our communities through the combination of rigorous research and partnership in implementation at scale. So this is a great opportunity to learn more about that. And thank you all for joining, and thank you, Marianne, for being willing to kick us off.
Thanks, Kate, for the introduction.
Can I first ask you a little bit about the Inclusive Economy Lab? That is a new name for the lab, and I would love to hear more about the evolution from the Poverty Lab to the Inclusive Economy Lab and what you're accomplishing under that new moniker.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for the introduction. And sorry for the video and for the sound, but I'm trying to do with whatever I have that works, that works right now. So you're correct. We started close to 6 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, under a different name, which was the Poverty Lab. And in 2020, we decided that it was a good time to kind of reassess whether this was, the right way to present ourselves to our partners, to the communities, and the people that we hope to serve. The change, I think, was the desire for the change. I think was present among most of us, even though we had not communicated about it for many years. I think the best way to describe it is that the Poverty Lab sounded very negative. It sounded more like, kind of describing what we were fighting against rather than positively describing what we were fighting for. So we really took a step back, very much, in the moment of the pandemic and the social unrest that was moving the country, and try to think about what is the best way to describe what all the people that are working for the lab are really, trying to achieve. And we ended up with inclusive economy because I think it described really, well, what our goal is, which is to try to provide insights via research as to how to make an economy that does not work well for a lot of people, work well and be, more equitable in the opportunities it offers everybody. The other thing that we like about this name is that it is very much about trying to change systems, trying to create, systems that are more inclusive rather than just studying an individual program or, a particular individual. So these two elements really kind of drove us towards this name change.
Thanks. That's really helpful in thinking about the holistic approach that you're taking to making the economy work better, particularly for underserved communities. And you recently got a very generous gift from the Margo Pritzker Foundation. I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the things you're hoping to do with those resources.
Yeah, so we're incredibly thankful to Margo and Tom for this very generous gift in our work. I mean, what we're trying to do with the gift is double down on many of the things that we have invested on already over the first years, but also kind of extend the work in new directions. So I'll highlight first the areas where we want to double down. I mean, we've been very much focused on trying to create basic stability for a lot of households, right? So a lot of opportunities are not going to be there for people that have to live from paycheck to paycheck, do not have the time to sit back, and think about, taking time off work to try to invest in new skills or more education. So foundational stability has been, a focus of ours and will continue to be a focus of ours. We are doing, several studies looking at impacts of UBI, kind of, that's a lot of people right now are talking about UBI, kind of how giving people unconditional money may help them, for the longer term, because they will spend some of this money in investing further in their children and in their own skills. So we want to do more work on, on guaranteed income. We want to think more about housing, and the rest of this panel discussion will talk about housing stability, but that remains a very important area of ours. So second area where we want to double down is thinking about how education can be an entry into good careers. And we're doing that really kind of twofold. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of people thinking about four-year colleges, but we know that four-year colleges are not going to be in the cards for many individuals. We know that a lot of first-generation, individuals that we hope to serve will not start in a four-year college, but will go via a community college route. So we have built over the years a strong partnership with the community colleges, and we want to keep on doing this work. Beyond, traditional kind of schooling and tertiary education, we think that more effort should be spent on other ways to build a career that may not require tertiary degrees, such as apprenticeship. So we want to spend more efforts documenting how apprenticeship are working, whether they're themselves inclusive. If they are not inclusive, what are the particular barriers that are in the way of allowing more kind of low-income households, Blacks, Latinx, into accessing and completing the kind of apprenticeship that will open the door to entering the middle class. And then finally, it is remarkable that over the 6 years of our existence, I stopped counting, we have not been intentional about thinking about race. Of course, we think that a lot of the work that we have been doing and will continue to do is indirectly helping people from, of color. But we want to be much more thoughtful in the work that we're going to be doing forward in thinking about various ways via which minorities might be excluded from opportunities. And that's just beyond studying discrimination the way I have done it, or a lot of economists have done it, in their work. But really thinking about the various ways via which policies that look like they are race neutral on paper may end up differentially impacting people of color. So I would say that these are the three big kind of pillars that kind of will be driving a lot of our work in a few years. A lot of the work that's been, again, kind of made available via this generous gift.
Well, that's a great jumping off point to dig into housing and think about the disparate impacts that we've seen overall, but of course, in particular in this COVID era. We know that Black and Latinx communities have borne a disproportionate burden in terms of health risk, adverse health outcomes, economic consequences of this twin recession and public health pandemic. And housing security seems like a really integral part of that and plays into so many other outcomes. What have you been seeing in your work on the threats to housing security in Chicago and how those are being felt in different parts of our community?
Yeah, so great, kind of great question. And obviously the rest of the event today will be focused on this with people that are, kind of further, kind of much closer to the data and much closer to what's happening on the ground. But I think there's we have been from the beginning of the pandemic, in touch with organizations, government agencies throughout the city that have been having at the top of their mind kind of the implications of the crisis for housing instability. As you said, kind of we've seen that both the health impact of the pandemic, but also the labor market disruptions have been concentrated in communities of color. So from that, it's pretty straightforward to imagine, seeing the data, that the risk of housing instability are particularly acute among these communities of color. This has been an ever evolving, crisis, because, every month we have new developments in terms of how much assistance is going to be provided to people that have been unable to pay their rents or pay their mortgages because of all of the disruptions that have been happening since March 2020. So what we have been, doing is multifold. I think we have been in contact with policymakers since the beginning, as I said, to try to see where we could play a role. And really our skills is about trying to bring the data forward when it's not available, trying to help policymakers in thinking about the impact of the policies that they are considering or putting in place. So we were there from the very early months when there was small amount of, kind of emergency assistance being provided to households, and we have stayed close to the city as things have evolved. More rounds of emergency assistance came forward, and obviously now big changes with the federal government kind of stepping in massive amounts in December of 2020 and more recently in March with the American Rescue Plan. In terms of what's going to be happening, I think there's still a lot that's very much unknown. I mean, we know that a lot of resources is coming forward and is going to be available to a lot of individuals that are late on their rents. And also, let's not forget, the landlords, Chicago has got about 50% of landlords that are just mom and pop landlords. So we have to think about both sides in the housing market. There's more and more resources that is there. It's going to be available. I think to me, the big question is whether these resources will end up, in the right place. Kind of deploying these resources, distributing it is complicated. We know that people are going to have to fill in forms, and people are going to have to participate in this process. So to me, the big unknown is whether we will have the level of participation in, trying to get access to these resources that we need, and where we'll need more push to try to make sure that people go and apply for the funding that they would be eligible for. So we have built a tool that I'm, particularly proud of, that we think will be helpful to organizations in the city, government agencies, a dashboard to try to see how things are going to be moving forward. Obviously, given the moratoria on evictions, there's been no action, but things may change quite dramatically in the next months as these moratoria are being lifted. So we're going to track this data kind of real time. We have also created a partnership with TransUnion, which give us access to credit report, which could provide, great signs as to where the greatest need will be at a very fine level of disaggregation in the city. So we hope that all of this data that we've put in together for the city this dashboard will be helpful in trying to identify areas of most pressing needs, such as, kind of legal assistance and legal clinics, so that people can indeed apply for, for the funds they should be eligible for.
So you've highlighted a couple of ways that I think the partnership between the Inclusive Economy Lab and government and non-government entities in the communities in which you work seems really beneficial on both sides. One is, you've just mentioned the importance of bringing data to bear so that you can actually find out sooner rather than later where there are problems that need to be addressed and where policies might produce the most benefit. But then, of course, there's also the evaluation of the policies and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work in a world of scarce resources, as you were highlighting. And, I think across realms, not just housing, of course, but you mentioned universal basic income, my own world of healthcare, there's so many policies that sound like great ideas, that are really well-intentioned, that just don't produce the kinds of benefits that people hoped for, or that a less rigorous anecdotal assessment might suggest. So I would love to hear in the big picture, how you work on that kind of careful evaluation, and maybe some examples of things you've seen that worked really well or things that didn't work as well as hoped for once you actually dug into the data.
Yeah, so again, great question. I mean, the evaluation, so besides kind of collecting data to try to inform, kind of policy, like I just described, what we also do a lot of, as you mentioned, is just trying to evaluate the impact of policies. And we are no different from, from the other labs in the way we do this work. So there are going to be situations where very naturally, we can bring in what is described as a gold standard for policy evaluations, which is to do randomized control trials. Sticking with the housing example, the housing situation that we just talked about, in these very early rounds of emergency assistance that the city was provided back in the spring of 2020, there was just not enough money to serve, the hundreds of thousands of households that were applying for this emergency assistance. In a case like this one, the city wanted to randomly assign who was going to get this, kind of restricted funding, to the extent that they could not serve everybody. Running a lottery felt like the fair way to, to allocate the money. So in cases like this one, it's pretty straightforward that we should learn from this, and we are in a good position to go ahead and evaluate that, which is what we're going to be doing when it comes to the impact of these early rounds of funding. There are going to be other cases where this approach is not possible, cases where, kind of it's not the case that you have a program that's oversubscribed, where more people want access to the program than than there are slots for the program, and then there's money for the program. And in cases like this, like those, we don't give up on trying to learn, about the policy impact, and we would bring in kind of more kind of quasi-experimental methods. Think about, kind of propensity score matching or finding funding control groups, with the understanding that these methods may not be as rigorous, but there's still a lot that one can learn, and one should not give up.
Does that introduce some challenges in your relationships with your partners in the field and in the community, trying to balance good partnership in facilitating implementation with rigorous evaluation?
Just challenge. I think we try to be, and I hope we are, I believe that we are kind of really, really respectful and understanding of what the partners are trying to achieve. And there might be situations where even though there might be the temptation to really try to push for doing an RCT, gosh, it's not right if, why deny people, kind of services if they're eligible for them. So it's really a question of respecting the partner and, trying to think through opportunities to learn within the constraints that, the partner faces. We feel like the work that we can do, we know that the work that we can do is not possible without the partners. What makes our model different is long-term relationship with partners. So I'm proud that we did not come to this work as like the academic that are just interested in the work for the purpose of like writing papers, but we really want to maintain these long-term relationships. We want to ask the right questions, which are often the questions that the partner really wants to answer more than the one that the academics is interested in answering. And we try to be as respectful as possible of what the partner views as being, as being really important.
Well, and you talked about the traditional old school academic model of writing a paper, sending it off into the ether, and just letting the evidence speak for itself. And that led to a lot of papers that were not connected to what people were really anxious for more information about, and also a lot of papers that just sit on the shelves collecting dust, metaphorically these days. How do you think about making sure that your research lands with impact, and that things that work get scaled up, and things that don't work, the word gets out and people try other things?
Yeah, again, this ties back to some of what I was saying before. I mean, first, as I said, kind of making sure that the questions that we answer are not solely guided by the academic, but are really guided by the partners. That's number one, because I think it's going to be really hard to interest a partner, be it a government agency or nonprofit, into findings if the findings are not answering the questions that they feel are the important one to guide, their subsequent decisions. So I think that's really the first important step. I think the second step is really having these long-term relationship. It's not just a one-off, that we're not just there to write a paper, that we're not just there trying to access data because we think there's a paper that can be written, but that we really are committed to producing results, communicating these results in a way that is understandable to the partner, and working on the next steps, right? So, the discussions of scaling, I mean, I've been at this for like 20 plus years, probably longer than that, Kate. It's probably more than 20 years. You know that. We started this together. Yeah. I mean, these questions of scaling are always there, but they always feel to me like these very empty conversation. Yes, we know, kind of, we find good results, we should scale them, but how we scale and what goes into a scaling conversation, it's very difficult to get into. But once you are sitting with the partners for the long term, you get to the stage where you really can move forward with the early evidence and keep on learning more, right? So very rarely can you imagine that a program that was successful is going to be scaled exactly the way it was, because very often that would be, too expensive. So then, kind of that gives you the chance, when you have these long-term relationships, to really sit at the table. This is what we've learned. This is what is important, what is not important, and then kind of think about the next step and what the next version of the program would look like that could serve, more people. So, as again, long-term partnerships and making sure that the questions you ask are really guided by the policymaker. I think are two of the key elements, I think, that I view as being crucial to success.
So following up on the idea of informing policymakers and giving them data that they can actually use and studies that they can use to improve policy, we've talked a little bit about the interconnectedness of so many different realms of public policy in any given community, from housing to all of the other things we've talked about: income security, food security, access to health care, environmental hazards, all of these things coming together to either benefit or adversely affect different communities. How does that interconnectedness affect how policy should be made, or how policymakers should think about any given program?
It's interesting. I mean, I think, imagine, I'll take just one example, right? Think about kind of labor market policy. And very often when we think about evaluating the impact of a workforce development program, our sole focus would be, okay, did a job get created? This person still at a job? Is a job being, kind of better than what the person was able to earn prior to getting into this workforce development program? Obviously, the impact of a workforce development program should go and will go beyond, whatever you can see in UI data or earnings data. They will impact, the schooling outcomes of the children that, kind of most likely will have higher time attending school when, there's always money to put gas in the car. It will have health impact. It will have kind of, police involvement impact. So I think one of the things that, we really try to do in our work, and that's really extending the Inclusive Economy Lab to all of the other labs that we have at the universities, try to bring to bear the more, kind of inclusive data sets. And by inclusive, I mean kind of outcomes can be measured in many different data sets. And there's a lot of value in learning the impact of programs by linking data sets across sphere, whether it is police data, labor market data, schooling data, and as much as possible, we try to do this. And hopefully I describe the value in doing that.
So just one last question before I turn the microphone back over to Carmelo, and that is, we have a lot of students in the audience, a lot of potential students, a lot of perpetual students. How would you recommend that they get engaged either with the lab or with these issues or with partners around the city?
So, we see a lot of your students. We employ a lot of the students, whether it is
they're all excellent.
Summer internships, or once they complete their degree. We have job posting going on, and hopefully we'll have ability to expand thanks to the new gift. I think the only thing that they need to bring is just an appetite for the policy questions that we are interested in, and seeing the value of data rather than just pure advocacy in trying to provide answers to these policy questions. But I sure hope that, you know, we keep on seeing many more of the high school students into a lab, whether it is for just a summer or for a more longer term position.
Well, thank you so much for taking this time to tell us about the really inspiring work that you and the Inclusive Economy Lab are doing. And I know we have a full slate of really robust discussion about housing policy coming up. And so I will stop here and turn the microphone back over to Carmelo.
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks so much, Dean Baker and Professor Bertrand, for that really fantastic discussion about the role of research in affecting positive social change. I'm so excited to introduce you now to two of my favorite partners with whom we work here in Chicago, two of the smartest and hardest working people in public service in this city. Era Rendon is Vice President of Immigration Advocacy at the Resurrection Project. Era has served as a lead strategist and manager on local campaigns and has played a leading role in the successful passage of many pro-immigrant legislations, including driver's licenses for the undocumented, the renewal of All Kids Health Program, the Chicago Legal Protection Fund, and the Illinois Access to Justice Program. A documented immigrant from Oaxaca, Mexico, Era is part of the first class of undocumented students to graduate from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she's also an alum of the Civic Leadership Academy at the University of Chicago. Daniel K. Hertz serves as the Director of Policy, Research, and Legislative Affairs for DOH. He's been a key driver of many of the department's most impactful policies and programs, including the anti-deconversion ordinances for Pilsen and the 606, which were both designed to reduce displacement of low to moderate income residents while also maintaining the existing character and housing stock. He also worked on the Inclusionary Housing Task Force process, which led to the introduction of major revisions to the city's Affordable Requirements Ordinance, and the execution of 2 rounds of COVID-19 rental assistance grants, which provided nearly 10,000 households financially impacted by COVID-related shutdowns with much needed funds. Hertz will lead a 3rd round of assistance beginning in spring 2021. Finally, I'm really excited to introduce you to a colleague, a longtime colleague and friend of mine, Emily Metz, who is a program director overseeing our housing stability work at the Inclusive Economy Lab, as well as at the Health Lab at the University of Chicago. Before joining the labs, Emily worked for the Chicago Public Schools, managing the process of opening new charter schools, and also as a research analyst at the American Institutes for Research. She also has worked as a fellow in the Chicago Mayor's Office. And so just really excited now for the robust discussion that we'll hear today about the unique challenges of supporting Chicago's low-income residents in the midst of a global pandemic. So thank you all, Era, Daniel, and Emily, for making the time tonight.
Thanks, Carmelo. So firstly, I just wanted to extend my and our sincere appreciation to both Era and Daniel for taking the time to chat with us tonight. I personally know how busy both of you are leading the actual work that you're going to discuss this evening, and we are incredibly appreciative of the deep expertise that you're going to bring to this discussion tonight. So thank you in advance. To kick us off, we wanted to frame the discussion by first acknowledging the reality that the pandemic really exacerbated already existing inequities in all areas of life in our city, including, importantly, housing. I'm interested to hear each of you speak in terms of your vantage point from your work in your respective organizations to the pre-existing challenges the city was already facing in terms of ensuring all residents have access to stable housing, and to hear a little bit about how, from your perspective, the COVID pandemic enhanced or changed the approach that the city and your organization specifically have been taking to help prevent evictions and homelessness. And to kick it off, Daniel, if you wouldn't mind starting, that would be great.
Sure. And first of all, thank you so much. It's really exciting to be here to have this conversation. The pre-existing challenges were massive, obviously. I mean, I think people were using the word crisis well before the pandemic hit. The number that gets thrown around all the time in our work is 120,000 unit gap of affordable rental units. That comes from a series of reports from the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul. But, that really masks or is one part of a number of interlocking crises and problems that people in Chicago face in the housing sphere. One of them is simply not being able to afford the home that they're living in, and having that impinge on their ability to save for the future, to make other sorts of investments in their lives, or just have a stable home life. And we know that is most acute at the very lowest end of the income spectrum of people who are who have the lowest incomes, but does also include people in the sort of who do have even working class or middle class jobs in many parts of the city. And people who find themselves, maybe they had an affordable home, but they live in a neighborhood that has become so much more expensive over the last however many years that they sort of find themselves being priced out. At the same time, we have a huge, we have problems with lack of investment, of private investment in huge parts of the city where capital essentially is really scarce, and problems. We have issues with homeownership as wealth building not being an opportunity that people have in the same way that they have them in, to put names to it, in predominantly white neighborhoods, that in predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhoods, that is a much, there's much less of an ability to build that kind of generational wealth. We've seen reports, not shocking, I think, especially not least to people who have been living this reality, but, reports again in the last year or so about appraisal gaps and lending gaps. And, we see the department as having that being part of our mission as well, to stabilize on the homeownership side, on the appraisal side, those sort of owner-occupied fair housing issues, and wealth building issues, as well as the affordability and anti-eviction issues. And I know I'll try to wrap up, but the last part of the question about how the COVID pandemic changed the approach. I mean, I think it, in some ways, because there was this continuity in terms of the crisis in many ways, in many ways it just sort of refocused and allowed us to put more resources and efforts that we were already undertaking. But in other ways, it really transformed things. I mean, obviously, emergency rental assistance is the biggest way. I mean, we are now well into our third round, and collectively will be spending over $100 million of direct rental assistance since the beginning of the pandemic for a department that previously had never run a direct rental assistance program, and in fact had no plans to run one as of March 2020 because there was no funding. So that's a huge shift, and has allowed us to build infrastructure that I am hopeful that we will be able to hold on to and build on. We've also used CARES Act and ERAP funds to create an eviction legal defense program with the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing. That's a new program. And we've also just, been able to coordinate and put more resources into coordinating both across departments of the city, but also with the county and the state and other community-based organizations that we partner with to make sure that, know your rights materials are better distributed, better understood. We took out ads on the CTA trains and buses about know your rights for eviction and lockouts. And those are all things that I think are infrastructure that we can hold on to and build off of, for the years to come, knock on wood, after the pandemic is over.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking to that partnership piece, I think is a great segue to Ere to hear her vantage point, from one of those community-based organizations with which you're partnering, and whose work is very deeply embedded, at the community level.
Yeah. So, immigrants generally, right, have faced a lot of challenges in the past, and so I want to just talk a little bit about those. To your question about, what is it that we saw again during the pandemic, right? One is that immigrants are actually moving out from the city and going into suburbs and going into, the collar counties. And so we're much more spread out. And so it's just challenging to be able to get to immigrants, and then understanding the nuances of what is a municipality and things like that is difficult. Immigrants, and particularly undocumented immigrants, are excluded from many assistance programs, right? We don't get unemployment, we don't get, health insurance, and most health insurances. We did pass a law in Illinois last year to allow undocumented adults over 65 to get Medicaid, but before that, that didn't exist. And left out of things like the federal stimulus packages. And so because of that, to tell an immigrant that they are eligible for a particular program needs to be centered to whatever program does include immigrants. And then not to mention, we just came off of 4 years of an administration. We were actually in an administration when the pandemic hit that had been targeting immigrants. And then in particular, with this idea of public charge and saying that anytime you were going to receive a public benefit, it was going to perhaps jeopardize your ability to be able to legalize in the future. So it was a very trying time to begin with. And a few of other, on top of those, there are also challenges, right? Like language barriers. We speak hundreds of languages, although the majority of immigrants in Illinois are Mexican and speak Spanish, right? The documentation for programs, everything from leases that our communities don't necessarily have, as well as things like proof of income can be challenging in our communities. Sometimes your utilities are not under your own name. Sometimes you don't even have an ID to prove who you are. And then if there's no information in your language, then you may just not even know about the program. And I just want to give you a quick example about my mom. So my mom was actually able to, we're undocumented, she was able to buy her home back in the early 90s. She lives in a small town by Wisconsin. The way that she was able to buy that home was she actually had her brother, who's a US citizen, purchase it under his name. And so right now, all of her utility bills continue to be under her brother's name. And some of them we switched over to mine and my brother's name and instead of my uncle's. But what happens then when she's going to apply for these programs where she is low income, but perhaps her children aren't, but the names of the utility bills are under her children and under her brother's names. So it's just those types of barriers that I think folks don't necessarily understand unless you live within the community, unless you're part of this community. And so it was really crucial to have the types of partnerships we had between nonprofits and government agencies because we understand those nuances. And then on top of that, and COVID, everything went online. Folks don't necessarily have computers or internet access. So we've had a very trying year and a half.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing those nuances into this conversation. And I think that your response really speaks to the importance and the value of the city being able to partner with community-based organizations that are deeply embedded with the residents in different neighborhoods, who each of which are facing a unique set of barriers, to getting access to the assistance they need. So with that in mind, I'm curious to hear you both speak a little bit more. You've certainly already alluded to this, but it certainly seems from our vantage point at the Inclusive Economy Lab, where we are, sort of partnering so closely with agencies and nonprofits on an ongoing basis, that during the pandemic, it has really necessitated unprecedented levels of coordination among and across city agencies in partnership with community-based organizations, and even walking in lockstep, with the philanthropic community, all in service of helping to secure and distribute cash and rental assistance at a much greater scale than we've ever seen, previously, particularly in, this period of time, this short period of time in the past year or so. Both of your organizations are involved in the Emergency Rental Assistance Program and currently partnering to help oversee that program and distribute those funds, reflecting this heightened focus on coordination. What do you see, a year or so into the pandemic, as the key benefits and challenges of engaging in this type of collaboration? And Ere, if you'd like to actually kick it off.
Sure. Yeah, of course. So I think, one is that government is so massive And if you just take one individual organization, we're not that massive, but if you take a whole bunch of us, then we're able to pool our resources, right? Government isn't going to be able to have enough staff, as well as neither is just one nonprofit. So I'll give you some examples that we were able to do as a Chicago Resiliency Fund, as well as the current ERAP program. The city is working with us in terms of the rental assistance right now. It allows us to quickly subgrant to a bunch of different organizations. So the city or the state only has to do one contract with one nonprofit, and then and that tends to move slower. Sorry, Daniel, government is a little bit slower. And so because that moves slower, we can get things going on our end to make things, as soon as we get whatever it is that we're waiting for from the government agencies, and then that triggers all of the contracts that we can then do. And there's not as much bureaucracy from, nonprofit to nonprofit than there is from nonprofit to government agency. It also allows us to, be able to partner with organizations across the city or across the state that are going to be able to reach people where they live, in their languages, folks that are already trusted. You're able to tap into the infrastructure that exists within each of these organizations. So many of us have programs that already have been creating community navigator positions or parent mentor, leadership, and so we already have these grassroots leaders that are used to being in the community, that go to the same schools, that go to the same churches, that live in the neighborhoods of the folks that we are trying to target. And so government partnering with us allows us to break down that barrier. And then lastly, just making sure that folks feel that they can trust us, right? And so we already have reputations in our community. Folks already know who we are. They don't feel that they're giving necessarily their information, especially as it relates to undocumented folks, to a government agency. They're giving it to an organization that is also out in the streets protecting people from deportation, for instance. So those are the types of advantages that come with these type of partnerships.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Daniel, I'm curious to hear from your perspective on the agency side, how this coordination and collaboration, feels advantageous to you. Oh, you're still
muted. Yeah. Basically what Ere said, all of it. There are a whole bunch of reasons that we have to rely at, I can speak specifically to the Department of Housing's experience. We have to rely on, dozens of community-based organizations to do all sorts of the work that we do. Anything that involves, as exactly as I said, having relationships on the ground, being a known entity and a trusted organization in community, particularly with, people who have reasons to distrust the government or to distrust, somebody they don't know who says, hey, I'm here to help, right? With ERAP in particular, with the emergency rental program, we anticipated in all 3 rounds that we've run so far, we have had an online portal where people could apply, tried to make it as easy as possible. For a lot of people, having an online portal is the easiest thing. For a lot of people, it's really not. And we anticipated that in particular, the immigrant community would be one that we would struggle to get a proportionate number of applications through an online portal. And I'm happy to say ERAP and all of our rental assistance programs have been open to people regardless of their immigration status. But even so, for all the reasons I already talked about, it can still be a challenge. And so that's one thing where we did really rely on network of community-based organizations who have been operating in immigrant communities for years, for decades. And we saw in the data, we got much better pickup in, on the southwest side, parts of the northwest side, and far southeast side. We got much better pickup from our CBO partners than we did in just the general online portal. We've tried to expand that significantly this time around with additional focus on other underserved populations, such as people with a arrest or conviction record, LGBTQ and especially trans Chicagoans, people who have experienced domestic violence, and others who, again, have reason to need a more trusted sort of intermediary to help walk them through the system. So all of that has been really, really crucial. The one thing that I'll also just really briefly speak to is the intergovernmental coordination as well. I mean, this is where the American system of government just involves lots and lots of overlapping entities, right, who have shared but different responsibilities. You could create like a really complicated 3D, or maybe even you would need 4D Venn diagram to show everything. And, so for example, people in the city of Chicago can apply both for the city rental assistance program and the state rental assistance program. And that's kind of confusing. And so, we've been meeting with the state and the county, which also has its own program, but is only available to suburban Cook residents. We've been meeting with them weekly or more often for months to try to coordinate, communications, but also like on the back end so that we could figure out, if people apply to both, make sure that we have a way of dealing with that doesn't put the burden on the applicant. So all of that has been, that's always a really important thing, but it's been extra important as we've been sort of setting up new structures and new programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think embedded in both of, your responses in various different ways, you have already alluded to like the incredible administrative burden associated with managing programs as large as this. And I think that this is something that if you are working in a government agency or you are working in a community-based organization, this is a challenge that was apparent to you. But I feel like for the first time, maybe not for the first time, but like the pandemic really sort of enhanced the visibility that even the public writ large has into the administrative burden associated with distributing, truly unprecedented levels of cash and rental assistance as quickly as possible, like we've seen in the past year. So I'm curious to hear from both of you, if you can speak to, and you already have, I think, in a couple different ways, but any policy or programmatic shifts that really helped your organizations distribute assistance more quickly in the past year. And on the flip side, what do you view at this point as remaining policy, legal, or administrative barriers to really helping ensure that applicants are able to access funds in a timely fashion and quickly enough to really resolve their housing crisis?
Yeah, I think you're always one of the biggest challenges at the beginning of pandemic and when we were starting to stand up programs for cash assistance is balancing how much do you want to do in phone calls, because that is accessible to most of the population, versus how much do you want to do online, because to Daniel's point, you're just going to leave out populations that just cannot, just are not used to doing that type of application. We ended up, thankfully, a few years ago, as an organization, we invested in Salesforce and using Salesforce as our platform for most of our case management. It was truly like a lifesaver this time around as we stood up programs on top of being able to take in applications online simultaneously by doing them on the phone with somebody then entering the information. We could purchase licenses for our partners across the city and the state to be able to log in and use one centralized system. It allowed us to coordinate with our partners, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, to make sure that we were not duplicating efforts, particularly for cash assistance for undocumented households, because we could more easily share certain data that would allow us to be able to look out for duplicates. Was it a fall-proof system? Absolutely not, but it was the best we could do given the resources that we had and the amount of time. And you're constantly balancing how fast can you get this out, and with like how much do you want to make sure you have every single thing lined up for catching those duplicates. For instance, in my opinion, if one undocumented family gets a check of $1,500 and then another one of $1,000, they're still getting less than everybody else, and on top of it don't qualify for a whole lot of other stuff. So it wasn't like the sky was not going to fall, but we did have to make, because of the investment and the decisions we had made earlier in time, we were able to utilize those platforms. I do think in terms of policy, there was a real shift from the beginning of the pandemic to say that certain programs are not open to undocumented immigrants, to really shifting to making them open to undocumented immigrants. And I think it's because, you know, folks like Daniel and his colleagues started reading everything, and the federal government wasn't excluding folks from certain programs. So how do we make it the norm so that at least in the future, we don't have that barrier that folks think that they are left out?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I sometimes talk to people about like how the reality of the administrative burden and about, you know, ERAP in particular, and they'll say like, how hard can it be to give away $80 million? And you're like, well, you know, if you have to get these 5 pieces of documentation from people who don't know, you know, aren't comfortable using the internet or don't have the documentation for all the reasons that Ari talked about, and, you know, XYZ, it's like, actually, it's really hard. You know, we've been, I think, our reliance on community-based organizations like TRP, which was selected through a RFP process to be the main case management entity for this current round of ERAP, is huge. And I think, you know, in some ways we were fortunate because we created the first round of rental assistance basically at the end of March of 2020 with $2 million of our own money. And, you know, at the OH, 90% of what we do somehow is touched by federal money, which comes with all sorts of regulatory and reporting and compliance requirements. And you know, we were kind of free of that when we first started. And also we were in the, you know, the absolute peak of sort of emergency, everybody running around with their hair on fire. And so, you know, that allowed us to create an incredibly streamlined program with another partner, the Family Independence Initiative, where really, you know, we were asking for proof that people lived in Chicago and proof of, you know, some kind of proof of income, which could even be self-attestation. And that was basically it, you know. And, you know, we were administering that truly with volunteers from other parts of the department who weren't doing their regular jobs because we had just gone, you know, started not coming into the office, and we hadn't figured out how to work remotely yet. So we were passing around Excel spreadsheets, and like, that's how we were managing the first round. Now, of course, you know, that works kind of when you have like 1,500 people that you're giving awards to. When you have like 10,000 or much more than that, we now have had to build out other, you know, pieces of infrastructure. So we've, you know, contracted with a software company called Uncork to provide, you know, sort of administration of both accepting the applications and administration of it. And you know, have contracted with now groups like TRP to provide, you know, dozens and dozens of people who are just there to answer phones and to help people complete their applications successfully, and you know, and then process the applications and approve them. But you know, it was remarkable how, you know, the infrastructure for simply getting cash out to people who need it, which is in many ways just the most obvious way to help people who have just lost their job or have just incurred huge additional costs because, you know, somebody is sick or they have to, you know, whatever it is, you know, that infrastructure just didn't really exist. And I think we're still kind of catching up to what we need to have in place to do that in a really efficient way.
Yeah, I mean, as you both have noted in various ways, like, you really were working to scale program, like you were sort of building the plane as you were flying it and working just under incredible time pressure, you know, to get as much money out as quickly as possible. I'm curious, you know, throughout the course of the past year, as you were trying to do this, are there examples that you have of how timely access to data or research has helped support you in this work? And in terms of looking forward, you know, what ongoing role do you see research and data-driven decision-making playing in helping ensure households remain stably housed in the coming months and years?
Emily, we say we build the bridge, we build the plane, fly the plane, get people on the plane, and fix the plane all at the same time. So I think we had been talking a lot about, where folks live. How do you make sure that you're reaching them through the organizations that are where they live? What languages do people speak so that you're reaching the right organizations to be able to provide those services? And then using data to see, what worked better. Was it the online applications? Was it the phone calls? Was it the, somebody door knocked at their house and then that's how they actually were successful? Those things are really crucial. I think we all have learned so much over this last year and a half. And this data is going to inform us, I think, even more for the future if we have future crises, as well as how do we reach the really, hard to reach population? How do we make sure that we are always making accessibility part of the center of this type of work?
And Daniel, from your perspective?
Yeah, we have been really excited to, from close to the beginning of this process, having partnered with the Inclusive Economy Lab to help gather data around this, around our rental assistance program, which I think has been really helpful from everything from, just like where are we getting applications and, where can we double down on, community partners to, we had a huge drop off in applications from the first to the second round, and helping figure out like, why did that happen? And, is it something as simple as people just didn't know there was a second round because there was just so much information flying around by summer 2020 when we launched the second round that stuff got lost in a way that, it didn't on, March 25th, 2020. And, that allowed us, especially now that we're doing a third round, it allowed us to think about like, okay, we don't want a repeat of a whole bunch of people just didn't know, right? And so we can take steps to, to reach out to people, to, more thoroughly reach out to our lists, and, just let them know. I mean, it's funny, a lot of, you can do a lot of different sort of sophisticated analyses of things, and often that is helpful, but a lot of times the data that you need is just super basic, like, did people know that we did this thing, that we've been running around trying to set this up? And it's like, actually, you haven't penetrated to the people who need it the most. And, you just need to try harder at that. And that's really, really, that's invaluable information to know when you're trying to do something like this.
Yeah. And I think to sort of conclude this portion of the conversation before we switch to audience questions, which folks should feel free to submit if they have them, based on sort of your expertise coming into the pandemic and the lessons learned from this past year, we wanted to ask, if both of you had a magic wand and were able to make meaningful changes to existing policies or programs, what do you think would be most useful to you in helping ensure all residents have access to safe and stable housing in the coming months and years?
Yeah, well, and I think what Daniel was saying is very true. It's about money, getting people money, right? But so if that's true, like, I just kind of wish that, so the federal government excluded undocumented immigrants, excluded dependent adults at the beginning for their cash assistance for the stimulus check. I'm like, doesn't the state also know that? So like, I wish the state just would have sent all of those folks their portion of stimulus checks so that it kind of gets most of the folks out of the way. We would still have to, keep working with the folks that maybe don't file taxes, things like that, right? But I think that it just seems so much like easier if that would have happened. And I do, as much as, we work on making sure that, that we pay the landlords directly, that is super crucial and super important. I wish there was more just here's money, people, and do what you need to do with it during this time. And then I'll end with my dad's story. All my family, my mom, my dad, my aunts, my uncles, me, we all got COVID at the beginning of the pandemic, early in March 2020. My dad, while he was recovering, so they all had to leave work. Of course, I was able to work remotely, but my parents are undocumented, and so therefore didn't have any income coming in. And they live in their home out by Wisconsin. While he was recovering from COVID, my dad got diabetic retinopathy. I don't know how to pronounce it. So he went blind in one eye. He doesn't have health insurance. He's undocumented. He was 62 then, 63 now. We finally found a doctor that was going to be able to see him without health insurance. And, each visit wasn't insanely expensive, but it was $120. And we were able to get the injections for free. My dad applied for the ICIRR partners funding, and he got a debit card in the mail. And his first appointment that he actually got his injection, we went first to take out the cash so that we would have money to pay the doctor. This, direct cash literally allowed my dad to be able to see again. He got his last surgery last week. And so though it's just invaluable, and you don't know all of the needs that people have, and just giving them that money allowed my dad to see. And that's just one story out of the tens of thousands of folks that we have been able to impact. Not just TRP, of course, but the city, the state, and the county, everybody working collectively to get folks money.
For my part, that's a really powerful story, and I think is really important. As an important view of the power that those sorts of interventions can have. For my part, there's a bunch of things that are on our wish list as a department. One thing that I will say, there's been a resurgence since the pandemic of conversation around universal housing benefit, and I think that that's one of the things where it matters how it's designed. It's one of the things where it would be devastating, obviously, if something like that were created and did exclude undocumented immigrants or others. Was designed in such a way that wasn't usable by others. But a well-designed universal housing benefit in the form of housing choice vouchers or unit-based vouchers, or something that looks like the Chicago Low-Income Housing Trust Fund or something, I think would be a game changer, both at the individual level and at the sort of structural government. It would change the way that we could create purpose-built affordable housing. So that's one thing that I think would be powerful.
So we do have a few questions from the audience. From Nicole Jardine, a PhD student. She noted, "I'm deeply impressed by the work that's been done, often collaboratively, to help all residents. Was there anything you wish you did differently in getting these assistance programs off the ground?"
More money, especially at the beginning when there was because the thing is that there was money that came in later, but at the beginning it was slower. And so that was really, really hard when the demand was so big at the beginning. I think measuring people's expectations, so being very clear about there are 180,000 undocumented immigrants in the city. We have enough for 9,000 people, and so you're setting those clear expectations, letting folks know that if the lines are busy, they're going to be busy for some time, but there are these alternative ways of calling, of getting an application in. At the beginning for the program we first ran, it was only through phone calls and not through online. Online came later, and in retrospect, I wish we would have done it at the same time. I wish that we would have been able to pay our community navigators bigger stipends at the beginning. We didn't prioritize that at the forefront. So really finding different and creative ways to be able to get cash into the pockets of the families that are often left out.
Same. Yeah, I wish that I think we have really built this up over time, especially in this third round, but I wish that we had even more robust on the ground outreach, and partners, been able to fund partners doing much more robust on the ground outreach. I think, and this is cheating a little bit, but time, I mean, there's so much stuff that, like, in setting up this last round in particular, we set up a whole bunch of infrastructure last year, and then Congress passed the stimulus in December, creating, on the one hand, giving us massively more money, which is extremely exciting, and at the same time creating a bunch of additional program requirements that basically meant that we had to scrap all of the things that we had built last year and start over, and do that as quickly as possible. And normally you would have a couple months to test things and to just sort of fine tune and kick tires, and we didn't this time, and that leads to just more complications and more difficulties for people actually trying to get the help. So I wish we had been able to do that, but we keep learning in every new round.
Yeah, and obviously, like, incorporating lessons, and as is clear from the conversation. Switching gears a little bit, we had a question about how the pandemic is affecting small landlords in Chicago, and from both of your perspectives, why you think this is important.
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem, especially even I will always talk about immigrants, so I'm going to talk about immigrants again. And immigrants rent from other immigrants because of, if you don't have the documents that you need, or they're just like willing to take a chance on you because you may not have credit, and so it's a double problem also in this community, and so if it might be that both folks don't have documents, and then that becomes an ongoing issue as well. So that's a big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing that we have heard a lot of, especially around this last round, is, tenants and landlords can be part of the same application, and a landlord can actually initiate an application on behalf of their tenant in this round. But we cannot fund a landlord only application. So, obviously tenants need a ton of assistance, but there are also landlords who maybe their tenant was unable to pay and they've moved. It's because it's been well over a year, right, since the beginning of the pandemic, and those are, maybe they have 6 months of unpaid rent. They no longer have contact with their tenant, their former tenant, and we basically can't help them. We don't have funding that is available to help those people stabilize their buildings, and that's an issue for those individual landlords. It's also a community issue, because we know that these economic impacts have been very much disproportionately felt in lower income communities and immigrant communities, Black and brown communities, and when a bunch of small owners are having the same sort of cash flow issues, that becomes a community stability issue. So that definitely is an ongoing challenge.
And to cap it off, I'll reveal that this question comes from Professor Bertrand, and it's the type of pointed question that I have become familiar with as a member of her team, but it's directed at Daniel. There's only one more month before the expiration of the eviction moratoria will be lifted. Are you confident you can get the money out quickly enough to prevent potentially a wave of evictions?
So, what I can say is that we and the state are getting the money out as quickly as we possibly can, and are, making as many adjustments as we can within the boundaries of the, Treasury guidance about how to get money into people's hands. I'll also say we are working closely with the courts, with legal aid, and, so the sort of whole ecosystem of people who work in the court system to make sure that, when people do get into the courts, because I mean, even before, again, to hit on a theme that we've hit on many times, even before the pandemic, the eviction process was a crisis for many people in the city. So, we are also trying to make sure that people, if and when they do enter eviction court, if there is a filing, that they, we have a just process to keep people stably housed or make them, keep them as stable as possible through that process. So that's my answer for that.
I think that concludes the questions that we've received from the audience. I do think we have just a minute or two left. If there's anything that we've discussed, that either of you feel like you would like the opportunity to sort of underscore, or if there's anything that we didn't get to that you want to make sure the audience sort of leaves with, I'm happy to have, either of you share sort of parting thoughts or comments.
Yeah, Emily, I just want to add how awesome it's been to partner with the lab and to be able to do it. It's been really respectful of, the data that we're able to share, given, how sensitive this is. And, hearing from us, what is it that we want to know to help us better serve our communities in the future, as well as using it as a platform for advocacy. So, it's not partially, yes, it is about making sure that we're doing things better, but the other part is how crucial these partnerships are to make sure that we're still getting money out into our communities, that we continue to be a priority, and to show and demonstrate that when you do things in a way that reach vulnerable populations, they will participate.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I can assure you that the feelings are entirely mutual and that our entire team remains in constant awe of the work that both of you do at your respective organizations and are incredibly grateful for the partnership. Daniel, any parting thoughts?
No, just I'll similarly just express a huge amount of gratitude to Inclusive Economy Lab and to TRP and all of our community partners who have helped us do as much as we can over the last year plus to mitigate the effects of the pandemic.
So I think at this point we can turn it back over to Dean Baker or Carmelo whenever they're ready.
Thanks, Emily. And thank you, Eda and Daniel, once again for your partnership and for your time staying late with us this evening to share about your work. I have to echo Emily's sentiments. It has been truly humbling over the last year to see how hard our partners in public service have worked. I don't think that the general public has an understanding of the many, many, many hours that you all have put in over the course of the last, 18 months or so. But I think it is evident in the work that you've been able to do, the ways in which you've been able to fill in gaps in the safety net, the ways in which you've been able to thoughtfully connect with groups in the city who otherwise would not be able to access this critical assistance. So I just, as a citizen of Chicago, as well as a partner, just wanted to thank you for the incredible sacrifices I know you both made over the last year to serve my neighbors and friends and family. So with that, I wanted to also just thank everyone who was able to log in tonight to learn a little bit more about this critical work and about our partnerships with DOH and TRP. I also wanted to encourage folks to log in for the next event at which our colleagues at the Health Lab will be sharing a little bit about their work on improving the first responder system. And that Summer of Social Impact series event will be happening shortly in the month of July with invitations to follow. So with that, thank you to everyone who joined tonight. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Dean Baker for the invitation to share about our work, and to Professor Bertrand for sharing her perspective as well. And I look forward to seeing you at another event in the future.